We're less than a week away from an election that is sure to have real consequences for our country and the world. Today, we have three exceptional Intercept journalists who have been covering this election cycle in depth. They each have unique expertise that can help us understand what's at stake. Jessica Washington has been tracking the evolution of both campaigns' foreign policy positions, also studying their perspectives on immigration and reproductive rights, and closely following the trajectory of Vice President Harris. Matt Sledge has been covering how corporate interests and economic policies are shaping the race. And Akela Lacy has been investigating campaign finance, campaign promises, and issues related to federal law enforcement. They'll help us understand not just what might happen on November 5th, but what could unfold in the days and months that follow. We'll talk about a few possible outcomes and explore the policy shifts and institutional challenges they might spur. We're going to talk about Israel's war on Gaza, immigration, reproductive rights, and other issues. Throughout, we'll be incorporating questions that we're receiving from you, members of the audience. So, one note before we get started. The Intercept is a reader-supported newsroom. That means that if you like our reporting and you want to see more of it, please click the link in the chat to support us. Also, as a 501c3, we cannot endorse candidates for public office. Our goal today is to provide factual, nonpartisan analysis of the potential policy implications and institutional impacts that could result from this election. So with that, I want to welcome Akela, Jessica, and Matt. So we can't endorse candidates, but our colleagues across the for-profit media world certainly can, though this year the owners of the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times decided against doing so. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the media's role in this election. Akela, how has the mainstream media approached the coverage of Harris and Trump? And how do you think it might shift should Trump win?
So the approach to covering both Harris and Trump's campaigns has really been shaped so far this cycle by the chaos of the Democratic nomination process, switching at the last minute, for one of the first times in history, starting this goes back to the media's treatment of Biden, sort of with kid gloves before he even dropped out. I would say sort of holding Trump at arm's length. And then when Harris became the presumptive and then the official nominee, we saw a bit of a shift in coverage. Something I observed was this sort of like last gasp, people, finally having a little bit of hope. There was like the sense that there was life breathed back in to the Democratic Party and their campaign. And so you saw some of that in this sort of breathless, hopeful coverage of Harris, wondering, could she be different from Biden on foreign policy, on abortion, on all of these hot button issues? I think some of that is the effect of the major shakeup on the campaign trail, people having to pivot and not having a lot of information from Harris about what they could expect from her, but also Harris and the campaign not having a lot of information or plans about what they were going to do and how, if any way, they were really going to try to differentiate themselves from Biden. So without, a lot of substantive stuff coming from Harris in early days, we still saw the media really give her the benefit of the doubt in terms of what people were expecting on Gaza, what people were anticipating in terms of what outreach she might, give to the left. This, of course, is coming from outlets that had people shedding tears when Biden dropped out of the race and, they were writing eulogies. So I think in some ways, a lot of that hopefulness has deflated as, we've gone through the DNC, we've gotten a lot more information from Harris's campaign. But I'll say that for Harris. And then for Trump, people went above and beyond covering his indictments, his convictions. I think media are trying to do a little bit of a better job than they did in 2016 and 2020 of like saying the thing that matters, saying that Trump is lying when he's lying, saying that he's being racist when he's being racist. I will say, I think they're doing a better job in that. But I think there's still this balance of how much can we contextualize without amplifying in the way that the campaign wants us to amplify to play to their base and give them what they want.
Thanks, Akela. Jessica, you've also been following the Harris campaign and the media coverage of it. How has it evolved? Did you see the similar trajectory that Akela is describing of hope that has now been punctured as we get really close to Election Day now?
Yeah, and I definitely have seen a lot of the kind of similar patterns that Akela is talking about. A lot of kind of hope even from some more left-leaning news organizations, that Harris might, particularly when you looked at her 2020 campaign, and how she ran then and how she ran for Senate in particular, I think there was some hope that she would have there would be more of a difference between her and Biden. And whether or not even I can kind of classify some of those journalists as hoping, I think that was definitely how she was covered and framed, as kind of this change candidate that we really haven't necessarily seen borne out in the campaign. So I think that has been a shift. I think now that she's doing more media interviews, I think the coverage has been a little bit more favorable, even if the policy stances haven't shifted or in fact have gone farther right the more we've heard from her directly. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch what the press corps does with her, if she makes it into office. I think that's something that I'm really going to be looking for and paying attention to. I mean, I think one thing that Harris does well in differentiating herself from Biden is she's much more of an empathetic speaker in a lot of ways, particularly about these progressive issues that people care about. So although many people have arguably seen through it, I would say that she can definitely talk about the issues going on in Gaza in a different way than Biden does, in a more empathetic way than Biden does. She can talk about immigration in a more empathetic way than Biden does. So it'll be interesting to see whether kind of the rhetoric, how much focus there is on rhetoric versus action, if she makes it into office.
Really good point. I think the proof of it is always the proof is in the policy, right? We'll have to see what changes. Matt, you've written a lot about the corporate influence in both campaigns, with some recent coverage really highlighting the way that cryptocurrency has jumped out as an issue for both sides. What fundamental differences do you see in how Trump or Harris might approach business and financial regulation, and what do you think that actually means for most Americans?
Yeah, so I think there are two answers here. One is, if Trump wins, he's made it pretty clear that he wants to pursue deregulation of a lot of industries, everything from energy, oil, and gas to cryptocurrencies, and tariffs, which could have kind of an unpredictable impact on businesses. A lot of economists say it could actually kind of make inflation worse. And then on the other hand, we have Harris, who's a little bit more enigmatic on her economic policies. I think there's a lot of questions about whether she will pursue some of Biden's more progressive economic policies, especially when it comes to antitrust, when it comes to regulations. When you look at something like the SEC's enforcement actions of the cryptocurrency industry, would Harris continue that? We don't really know, because she has put out statements and taken positions that are kind of hard to interpret. One great example of that that I wrote about is this opportunity agenda for Black men that her campaign released, suggesting that cryptocurrencies could help Black men grow wealth. It really wasn't very specific about whether and how she would seek to regulate cryptocurrencies.
Just leaving a lot unanswered. I'll give a follow-up question just asked by a member of our audience today. Do you think that if Harris wins, Lena Khan will remain at the FTC?
That's the $1 million question, right? And I think anybody who tells you they know the answer to that is lying, just because she has been so enigmatic on questions like that and has kept the answers closely held. I do think there's a pretty good argument to be made that the business tycoons who have come out for Lena Khan in the last few weeks have actually improved her job security, because they've made her even higher profile, and it would be seen as such a cave-in to the business lobby if Harris does remove her.
Thanks, Matt. Akela, one area of just huge public fascination is the Supreme Court right now. It's the center of pretty much every hot button issue, and it's really deciding in only one direction recently. What might we see under these possible outcomes under a Trump victory, under a Harris victory? What do we expect out of the court?
So, before this cycle, Harris has said that she's been open to packing the court. As the Democratic presidential candidate, she said she's supportive of reforming the court. I think this was she just floated this last week at a town hall in Pennsylvania, but without a lot of specifics there, which we know how that tends to shake out. So Democrats have historically been very timid about taking sort of like the drastic measures that Republicans have taken to reshape the court. I think there's a lot more at stake than there has been in the past. Both Biden and Harris have made a lot of commitments about codifying abortion, which would require either doing some sort of court reform or eliminating the filibuster, both of which they've both said that they've been supportive of, but that we haven't seen any movement on. I think under Trump, we can definitely expect him to continue, what we've seen under his administration, which is also a really big part of his campaign strategy, being very clear to voters: if you vote for me, I will put conservative justices on the Supreme Court to enact, a conservative agenda, whether that be pro-corporate, anti-abortion, et cetera, et cetera. I think he wants to keep Leonard Leo in business. So I think we'll continue to see him appointing extreme further, the candidates that he's already, or the justices that he's already appointed to the court, are extremely conservative. But I think we can expect more extreme appointments because right now with the balance of the court, they have enough people to, obviously have overturned Roe v. Wade, to do a lot of the things that Trump has promised to his voters. But in terms of going further on abortion, and I know we're going to talk about this later, I think we can expect some more sort of extreme people popping up in his potential appointees, should there be openings.
Jessica, Trump has made a lot of promises, not just about the courts, but also, pledging on to be dictator on day one, a dictator for a day. And it actually appears he might be more emboldened this time to follow through on some of his promises, at least more so than in his first term, which was, really bumbling in a lot of ways. Who might be empowered under a second Trump administration, under a Trump administration that I think many fear might be more effective than his first one?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And fortunately, unfortunately, we do have his first term to look at, as you mentioned. And I think we're definitely going to see, I think everyone has brought this up, we're definitely going to see corporate interests empowered. I think that's why we see, obviously, someone like Elon Musk really falling over to support Trump and to kind of pour money his way. Certainly, we're going to see corporate interests empowered. I think if you look at his housing plan, which we analyzed, if anyone wants to go look at that. But that certainly kind of shows who he values. Obviously we're going to see, I think we can look kind of at real estate development. Those folks are all definitely going to be empowered under a Trump administration, kind of the tech sector as well. A mix of obviously threats and empowerment on that end. So I think those are kind of the groups, aside from obviously the more, depending on who your boogeyman is, also kind of, we're going to see white supremacists empowered, certainly under the Trump administration. I think that's something to definitely pay attention to. Particularly, we could see Republican governors feeling much more empowered to enact these draconian conservative policies. So I think that's going to be, we're going to have to look both at the kind of federal corporate level and then the corporate level, and then also at the states and what's going on with governors. I think certainly we're going to see some of those folks feeling a lot more comfortable than they did before.
One of our audience members raises a question that I think speaks to kind of the single person most likely to be empowered under Trump, and it's himself, right? This is with desire from the Heritage Fund and others for a very powerful executive branch, and knowing his track record as someone who really seems to see no limit to the type of power he wants to make personally. Audience members asking, and they'd like to know what, under a Harris administration, what, if anything, could be done to prevent a future president from, further weakening, ignoring, or even weaponizing the DOJ?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and it's a reasonable concern. Trump has certainly, in his first term, attempted to weaponize the DOJ. I think now he's had time, preparation, and assistance from folks who now see that he's here to stay. And so there's definitely reasonable concerns that he plans on weaponizing the Department of Justice. I think in terms of what can be done, I think that really has to do, well, first we'll have to see who takes over Congress, but that would really have to depend on Congress kind of stepping up in their oversight responsibilities. Certainly we've seen seen calls for them to step up their oversight responsibilities towards the Supreme Court, I think, as well. With the Department of Justice, we'd have to actually see Congress really take a much stronger hand on that if we wanted to prevent a future President Trump in this scenario, or J.D. Vance perhaps, from being able to weaponize the Department of Justice.
Thanks. And sticking with you, Jessica, Trump has really campaigned pretty centrally around the idea that immigrants are harming the country, right? He's promised mass deportations as a key to solving all of the domestic woes. He's even made the case, as you alluded to, that you could solve the housing crisis in the US by deporting millions of immigrants and taking their housing and adding it to the inventory, which would drive down prices. It's a it's a shocking policy, to say the least. I mean, based on your reporting, what's it mean to actually implement a mass deportation policy?
Yeah, I mean, it would be obviously devastating. So we can talk about the personal toll of mass deportation. Obviously, thinking about our neighborhoods, our communities, the people that were around who would be impacted. So I think that's kind of the first place we have to think about when we think about the impact of something like mass deportation. I mean, it's not possible to deport every single undocumented person in the United States, but even a close attempt would be catastrophic and devastating. We can also talk about the economy, which Trump has said, repeatedly blamed undocumented immigrants for all kinds of ills within our society, within our economy in particular. And there's no evidence that mass deportation would solve our economic woes. If anything, it would really hurt production of a lot of products that people in the United States rely on. Housing is a really good example of that. I think I'm trying to remember the exact percentage and it's escaping me now, but a very large percent of undocumented immigrants in the United States work in construction. So if we were to actually implement mass deportation, it would be disastrous for our housing system that's already in crisis. I think you could look at almost every sector and mass deportation would be a disastrous policy. But then obviously we have to think about the human element, and that's, I think, for most of us here, kind of the guiding light on that.
An audience member asked, would he target only undocumented immigrants or other immigrants as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And from everything that Trump has said, from everything J.D. Vance has said, certainly it would not only be a focus on undocumented immigrants. We've heard Trump, and I believe Vance as well, talk about temporary protected status, particularly for Haitian immigrants in the United States. And these are groups who are not undocumented, who, I don't want to moralize about any of this, and I don't think that's helpful about who got status this way or that way. But what I will say is, Trump is certainly not only a threat to people in the United States without documentation.
Akela, you've been covering how local law enforcement might get involved in policing immigration, which has not historically been their role. What are you seeing here? What are you looking at?
So, Trump has repeatedly talked about further militarizing the police broadly, but particularly for enforcing immigration, deputizing state and local police and the military to deport people, using the National Guard to deport people en masse. But I will say that this is something that is of concern if either Harris or Trump are elected. The ICE has local agreements with state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. I think there's 157 agreements currently in effect. That was as of 2021. So this is something that allows local law enforcement to issue ICE detainers, to issue issue the documentation that basically starts the removal process, to transfer people into ICE custody, to effectively work as local deputies of ICE to deport and target people. There's a lot of concerns about this for many reasons in terms of increased racial profiling, giving and sharing information between local law enforcement and police that can lead to unlawful detention, all sorts of things, unlawful removals. But so yeah, that all is happening already. The 287G program has been a lot of people have been paying more attention to it and raising more concerns about it. And so the amount of federal funding is lower now than it has been. You know, I say going back to 2013, it was like 68 million. Now it's down to 24 million. This is under Biden, but I think you could see a situation under Harris, who has already really talked about cracking down further on the border, cracking down on undocumented immigrants, also doing a similar thing, you know, enhancing these agreements or trying to revive them in some way. But I think the difference with Trump is his real explicit indication that he intends to either to amplify the role of local and state police in immigration deportation and potentially create new ways for them to cooperate that they haven't been, you know, that aren't explicitly public information. You know, this reminds me of, you know, him calling border patrol agents to like hide in protests in Portland back in 2020. So he does crazy things all the time. I think we could see a lot of different ways that he could deputize other federal agencies to do local enforcement and vice versa.
I mean, one open question is whether he'll really lean on state police forces in states where he has gubernatorial allies, right? Texas is one that I think has gotten a lot of attention. You know, these border state with you know, pretty strong state police force that could be, you know, put into a very different role potentially under a Trump victory.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen, you know, Trump lean on his allies in state governments around election denialism stuff, around policing more generally. You know, this is obviously something that state officials are also using to campaign on right now. So yeah, I would definitely be keeping an eye on what's happening with Texas and Greg Abbott. What's happening in Georgia? What's happening in New Mexico, Arizona, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Matt, you've been kind of monitoring Harris's views on immigration as well, and I think everyone has seen a real shift. Do you want to talk a bit about how her views have changed and what that might mean for immigration under a Harris victory?
Sure, it's really quite the shift. I mean, if you go back to 2020 when she was running in the presidential primary, it was all about reversing the cruelty of the Trump years and about offering people pathways to citizenship. Then you fast forward to when she was serving as the vice president for Biden, and in 2021, when he tapped her to go to Central American countries to look at the root causes of immigration, she went to Guatemala and said, "Do not come." And now, fast forward even further to the present, and she's really promoting this agenda of really tamping down on asylum rights. She backed this compromise bill in the Senate that would give the president emergency authority to really restrict asylum claims. So I think it's important to remember, looking back historically, that the Obama administration was actually much more efficient at removing people from the country than Trump was. And I'm not saying here that Harris and Trump are identical on immigration. Obviously, Harris has not called for deportation camps or using the military or anything like that. But we do have to keep in mind that Obama was actually kind of more successful, if you will, at using the levers of government.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing though is this kind of rightward lurch from both candidates, in which kind of the concept of immigration has really been hijacked and made you know, a singular purpose that needs to be reduced. Right? There's not there's the daylight between them is how much it needs to be reduced and the mechanisms for how. But it's an interesting moment to see both such unity between the two parties in the issue. So let's open the conversation up a bit to talk about Gaza. We've gotten so many questions from the audience about this. It's obviously you know, the story of our times right now. I think maybe we'll start by asking the reporters here to talk about how the candidates' approaches to Gaza might change, and then we can get into some of the specific audience questions. So yeah, Jessica, you want to start off and talk a bit about what you see about the U.S. policy toward Israel's war on Gaza under Trump and under Harris?
Yeah, no, I think I mean, with Trump, it's kind of anyone's guess exactly how he's going to operate in the foreign policy sphere when he gets there. I think he's a pretty unpredictable actor, but I think interestingly enough, we have two campaigns, two candidates that are a little unpredictable when it comes to foreign policy, particularly on Gaza. I mean, I think with Harris, what we can assume is that she would continue the same policies that the Biden administration has continued. Obviously, she's coming at it from a slightly different place. Biden is much more deeply entrenched, I would argue, in this kind of foreign policy consensus than Harris is. She's a little bit more outside. But I think with Harris, we're likely to see a general continuation of the same policies. So a general push for a ceasefire, a general push for a two-state solution, but not necessarily teeth in the way that I think a lot of people are hoping for and had hoped for, particularly in the beginning of her candidacy, when at the very least she was willing to say, to be empathetic towards Palestinians in her rhetoric, at least in a way that Biden was completely unwilling to. And I think on Trump's end, I mean, certainly we shouldn't expect him to be a friend to the Palestinians in Gaza. He's made no indication of that. In fact, I would imagine a more hardline policy coming out of a Trump administration. But again, neither candidate is really the candidate of supporting Palestinians, of coming to a quick resolution to the current violence, or more importantly, potentially, or not more importantly, obviously the immediate end of the violence is incredibly important, but kind of a long-term strategy that really values the human rights of Palestinians in Gaza. I'm not sure we can expect that to be an emphasis from either administration. I will say my sources in the human rights space are a little bit more optimistic about a Harris presidency. I've certainly heard on their end that her rhetoric seems to be somewhat convincing that she might be a little bit more of a friend than Biden has been, who, I mean, so that's kind of some of the conflicting reporting that I've been getting, but I think we can expect in both administrations, unfortunately, not an immediate end to the violence and the suffering that we're all seeing, unless something changes outside of the two candidates.
Akela, why don't I pass it over to you and just talk a bit about some of the reporting that you've been doing on AIPAC recently. It feels like one of the big questions, as Jessica just noted, is there's this some who are close to Harris seem to suggest that there maybe is some daylight between her and Biden, but we're not seeing it. And I think one of the questions is why, and I think one of the obvious question in the room is, well, is it campaign funding? Is it money? I'd love if you just talk a bit about your AIPAC reporting and really what you've seen from the spending on behalf of Israel in U.S. elections.
Sure. So, we just published this big investigation, basically tracking every dollar that AIPAC has spent so far this year from both its federal PAC and its super PAC, where it basically launched this new strategy, starting last cycle, where it started spending directly on campaigns after primarily having a lobbying presence in Capitol Hill, which includes a lot of things under the umbrella of lobbying, trips to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So, in the context of the presidential campaign, AIPAC funding is a little bit less pronounced, I would say. They're mostly targeting congressional races, but Kamala Harris has spoken at plenty of AIPAC conferences. Biden was a friend of AIPAC, and while they both like to talk about how strong of the language they use, in closed door meetings with Netanyahu, as Jesse said, like, there's no indication that Harris or Biden or whoever comes into the White House next year will shift significantly from what we've seen from the Biden administration. Part of that has to do with AIPAC, but I think it's a lot bigger than AIPAC. And I think we'll get to this a little bit later too, but generally the pro-Israel sort of status quo in Washington has been bipartisan. AIPAC is a big part of why it exists, but it's not the only reason that it exists. And so I don't think that you can really say like AIPAC is the reason that Kamala Harris isn't going to shift on Biden. This is tied up in so many other sort of intersecting issues, but it does come down to donors. I think in a lot of ways, there are major donors to the Democratic Party who have ties to AIPAC but aren't necessarily like part of AIPAC, who are all sort of, interested in maintaining this status quo for many reasons that, don't really have anything to do with Israel policy. A lot of it is maintaining the image that the U.S. is pro-Israel for a variety of reasons that are geopolitical, financial, et cetera, which we don't have time to get into here. But I will leave it at that. The only thing I would tack on, just in terms of like, what I think we can expect under Trump versus Harris, the shift now, at least from uncommitted folks, is really calling for an arms embargo, pushing this Sanders resolution that will be taken up in November to block the latest weapons sale to Israel. Harris has been pretty clear that she does not support an arms embargo. So that's sort of what's on the table. I think conditioning aid to Israel is also on the table, but difficult to do with the current attacks on members who have suggested, floated that in Congress. Trump's messaging is way more erratic. I think he's doing a little bit of more playing both sides of the coin, courting Arab and Muslim voters, telling them that Harris is pro-Israel, courting, pro-Israel voters and telling them that Harris is pro-Palestinian, which Matt has done some great reporting on. Shout out to Matt for his reporting on that. But Trump just today is tweeting like, I'm going to stop the terrible suffering in Lebanon, while, he's telling Netanyahu behind closed doors, do whatever you have to do. So his messaging is very duplicitous. Not that Biden and Harris's is less duplicitous, but they're just duplicitous in different ways.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience that I think sets up some interesting a place we could dive a little bit deeper. This question from an audience member says, I'm Muslim and planning to vote third party because Kamala won't stop the genocide. Do you believe Muslims will be blamed if Trump wins, and what repercussions might we face? I think that question of blame is something that is quite interesting, right? It's a very close race, and I'm just curious to see, that idea of will the Democratic Party and point to Muslim voters? Will it point to the left more generally? Will it point to young voters? Is this a thing that we're already hearing? Are there already indications of this? I just want to throw this out to the reporters because that was a poignant and interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know. I immediately, thinking about hearing that question, thought back to how Black voters were blamed for Hillary losing the election. And obviously that's exactly how all those polling, the exit polls shook out and everything. It's complicated, but yeah, I think the concern that Muslim voters are going to be blamed, and the same way that Black voters were blamed for not showing up for Democrats enough, for not particularly putting issues of policing aside when it came to voting in the election, because that was something that obviously hurt Hillary Clinton, for not putting issues of mass incarceration, for not putting the crime bill aside, and all these kind of various harms that have been done to the community. That was certain, the Black community was certainly blamed in the wake of that election. So I would not be surprised if Harris loses and we see that same kind of blame game shift, instead of focusing on unpopular policies, or really policies that I can blatantly call immoral. There's going to be, there always is, a scapegoat and a focus on the communities that were harmed by those policies. So I really wouldn't be surprised if Harris loses and the next week we get a million op-eds about how it's Muslim voters' fault for not just showing up and putting their needs and interests behind, and Arab voters as well, I would say, in addition to because obviously not, but yeah, so that would be my running assumption is that if Harris loses, we'll get a million op-eds about it. And as to the consequences, I'm sure other people can speak to those a little bit better, but yeah, that would be my guess.
Just a related question that I think kind of bridges off of that, which is to quote our our audience member here. Biden and Harris have voiced unrestrained support for Israel in the last 13 months. This has affected the perspective of many supporters and has cast a shadow over Harris's campaign. How significant is that shadow, right? That's the really who are the people who would have been Harris voters who are on the fence, who might not be voting, who might be voting for a third party? How large is that contingent? Does anyone have some thoughts on that?
I think it's a big contingent, but I truly don't think we'll know the answer until after the election, several days after the election. I think millions of people are making millions of decisions right now, really tough decisions, on this issue, on a bunch of other different issues. I think it's really going to be interesting to see how many people decide to vote for third-party candidates, like that reader said. How many decide to just sit out that top line choice on the ballot entirely, and how many kind of decide, that they're going to vote for one of those major party candidates. But the polling I've seen on this issue of kind of Arab Americans is not very convincing. It's a small demographic of people, so it's really hard to say what's already happening, since early voting is already happening. So I think this is one of those only time will tell situations.
Time in reporting, and Matt will be up trying to in Michigan, speaking to some voters there in the next couple of days. So I'm eager to see what your work on the ground reveals. I thought this was another interesting question from a guest here today who asks, are any Democrats more likely to oppose U.S. unconditional support for Israel under Trump than under Harris? So let me word it a slightly different way, which is, should Trump win, do we foresee Democrats being able to take the kind of unified opposition to Trump to actually bring about change here?
You'd think. You would think that, given how Democrats have held up Trump as sort of like the end all be all, which, I think in many ways is valid, despite, similarities in their policies. Like, the problem becomes then, who are the other people who might come in to attack us? In this case, being AIPAC. I think some of, Jesse has also reported on this too, like the fear and like the chilling effect that has been instilled in members of Congress by the examples that have been made out of people like, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, Marie Newman, Andy Levin, for sticking their neck out to oppose, whether it's supporting conditional aid, opposing funding for the Iron Dome, et cetera, et cetera. People are seeing that the cost of that is getting increasingly higher and higher. So while there might be sort of cover, under Trump to be more critical of Israel, I do think that the AIPAC question is still looming large in a lot of people's minds. And so I don't really think that would have, that would play out in sort of the logical way that we would expect it to play out, which is, just politics. Yeah.
That bridges into a couple questions we've gotten from members of the audience here, just asking what's to be done about AIPAC, right? If this organization has the level of influence that it does, if it can oust progressive members of Congress with very few misses when it chooses to go in, what can be done? Is there anything in voters' hands?
I don't want to sound too cynical. I mean, the big thing that people say to me is like, overturn Citizens United, which of course requires having a Supreme Court makeup that would do that and getting it to the court, which, lies at the feet of all the questions that we're talking about right now. The other thing is supporting other groups that are working against AIPAC. I mean, they have the benefit of, mega donor billionaire people who are all pooling their money together. I don't necessarily think that grassroots dollars or small dollar, powered organizations can necessarily compete with that, but that is like an avenue. I think really though, the fault for this lies, with Democrats who have like taken this money and set up a situation where they're allowing this major outside group to dictate races, dictate who can and can't be in the party, and like they're so sort of wrapped up in and dependent on AIPAC money that they've created the situation that they can't necessarily get themselves out of. I think if we woke up tomorrow and like Hakeem Jeffries was saying we have to get AIPAC out of politics, we would be having a much different conversation right now. But no one in the Democratic Party in leadership is willing to do that. We reported this year on how Democratic leadership some of the top recipients of AIPAC money are out here campaigning aside Cori Bush, endorsing her at the last minute in the face of like $10 million in AIPAC spending, and people are like, what's going on here? Like, you're taking this money and with one hand and like lightly condemning them with the other hand. So I think it really comes down to, can Democrats as a party cut the AIPAC money, get off the AIPAC money, and then I think that there's actually like a way to curb the influence without doing something like overturning Citizens United, which is important but unlikely.
Thanks, Kayla. One tack on question. Sorry to just keep your microphone unmuted here. Someone asks, look, there's a possible Democratic trifecta, unlikely but possible, and they ask, under that, would Senator Sanders' weapons embargo to Israel, have a chance? Is that a thing that could fly if you have the threefer? Do you foresee that actually gaining broader support in that world?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on what happens with this election. I think if Democrats see, it's already been borne out so many times. I don't know how much more information you need about how popular this is, but I think, a Harris win would boost that. A Trump win would put people a little bit back on their heels. But yeah, I certainly think you need a Democratic trifecta to even have a chance for this to pass. There's no way that they would consider eliminating the filibuster to do something like blocking aid to Israel. That's just like living on another planet. So yes, you absolutely need a trifecta, but I think then you also have to consider all these other factors that come into play, which is, Democrats weighing, if we do that, like, can we all do this together? And then like it's like a union, like, can we all do this together? And then we avoid, the backlash. And I think I don't want to speculate too much, but I think there are certain things that definitely need to be in place in order for it to even be a consideration. One of which is certainly control of all chambers.
So we'll do one more question on Israel's war on Gaza, then we can move on to some other topics and more audience questions. Another one from our guests today. Would a significant leftist third-party vote percentage encourage Democrats to move left, or have the neocons become their base? Would Democrats become more likely to punish, censure, and ostracize the left in their party, or adjacent to their party, or would they try to actually address some of their concerns?
I'll try and tackle this one.
It's a lot of speculative here, but
I know it's a lot of speculative.
It's a really interesting question. So I'm glad we're taking it on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm going to try and limit my amount of speculation in the speculative question. But yeah, I mean, the indication that we have from Democrats is not necessarily, at least in this race, right? I think in 2020, we saw them more willing to listen to progressives and to adopt some of their ideas. We saw the Green New Deal, Medicaid for All really kind of become something that they were like, okay, we'll move farther to the left. We see that there is an insurgent left-leaning movement, and let's try and get some of this energy. I think this election, we've kind of seen them really move away from that, really. And I think you can see it in the White House's stances towards progressive members of Congress. We had the White House press secretary, this is obviously before the election, but obvious before Biden stepped down and everything changed. But I think it still matters when we saw the White House press secretary call very publicly disparage progressive members of Congress on the ceasefire. We've seen Democrats definitely this cycle much more likely to condemn the kind of progressives in their movement. So yeah, I don't necessarily believe that the lesson that Democrats would take away from a leftist third-party candidate getting a significant portion of the vote, and I guess it depends how significant we're talking about, but if we're talking about just enough to spoil their victory, there hasn't been a good indication this cycle, at least, that Democrats would say, okay, we need to learn from the left. We need to adopt more voices from the left, because certainly they've been putting them at arm's length over the last 2 years.
Why don't we open up the conversation a bit to reproductive rights now? This was one of the key issues in the 2022 midterm elections, and it has been a key talking point for both campaigns. Akela, do you see Harris's position on it differing from Biden's? And beyond that, what might actually happen if Trump wins? Is a national abortion ban a realistic fear?
So Harris has effectively said basically what Biden has said on this, which is that she would support getting rid of the filibuster to codify abortion rights. But, Biden said that back in 2022, and that has not happened. So I don't think it's something for us to hold our breath for under a potential Harris admin. Mainstream media have also been hammering this idea that she is more able to meet the moment than Biden in terms of urgency and highlighting the severity of the stakes, where Biden couldn't. But it's not clear that that translates into any significant policy differences or approaches to codifying this without, control of Congress. Trump, very clearly wants to get rid of all abortion, has talked about an abortion ban. I think he sort of equivocated when asked about an abortion, when he's been pressed on it more recently, but that is what I think we can anticipate. I would also emphasize that, abortion is already banned or severely restricted in half of states. And a national abortion ban it's pretty close to reality for a lot of people in those states and in other states where abortion care is criminalized, travel for abortion care is criminalized, not declining to prosecute abortion care is criminalized. So it wouldn't take all that much to extend it further, which could happen in a couple of different ways, the least likely of which would be through Congress. I say least likely because it is wildly unpopular, and it would also require getting rid of the filibuster. It's kind of ironic that you need to do that either to codify or get rid of this, which is a lovely feature of our legislative system. But the more likely avenue would be policy experts anticipating that this would be done through the White House and through agencies under its purview. So banning Medicaid abortions, which are about 2/3 of current abortion cases, by enforcing the Comstock Act, which is this old anti-vice law that bans the mailing of abortion-related materials and could be expanded to effectuate a ban. And then finally, what we've already seen to be effective and what we can probably expect more of, which is more federal court appointments and getting the Supreme Court to take on national legal recognition of fetal personhood, and which would require, more right-wing appointees than who's currently on the court. But that, I think, is not beyond what we could expect under Trump.
Yeah, it does all hinge on the court. It all comes back there. So let's talk now just about the actual election and the immediate aftermath. I think Americans have grown to have a different expectation about what election night and the days after elections might look like in the last couple of years. So I wanted to just ask you, Matt, what should people be watching for night of, particularly with states that have kind of different ballot counting procedures? How would you encourage people on this call to kind of understand what they're seeing the night of? What should they be processing and thinking about?
Yeah, so I guess I hope we all know this by this point, but don't take too much stock in these numbers the night of. It's a process, and it can take days and days. Remember, in 2020, which was less close in the polls before Election Day, it still took the AP 4 days to call the election. So let's not forget about that. For starters, this is, if the polls are correct, which is not necessarily a given, an even closer election, I think we can expect pretty agonizing delays from Pennsylvania. Republicans in that state blocked changes that would have made it easier to pre-canvass mail ballots before Election Day. Nevada, mail ballots can arrive up to 4 days after election. Wisconsin, which kind of has similar problems to Pennsylvania, and then Arizona, where you can drop off mail ballots at a polling place on Election Day, and election officials obviously can't start counting those until the day of. So in all likelihood, it's going to take days and days and days. So if you're following, what Waukesha County is doing hour by hour on Tuesday night, I kind of think you're wasting your time.
I appreciate that guidance. I'll try to get some rest on Tuesday and be ready to hit the ground running Wednesday. So, that said, we expect it to be pretty busy in those next days. We're going to see legal challenges. That's the expectation now. We're already seeing lawsuits cropping up. Any sense of what the types of legal challenges we might see, what shape they may take this year?
Is that for me or for?
Yeah, I'll throw that to you, Akela. Yeah, go for it.
So we're already seeing the ideological groundwork laid for contesting the results. Just yesterday, Trump was tweeting out like the names of random counties in Pennsylvania, just like interspersed with expletives, like what is going on in Pennsylvania, calling on law enforcement to intervene. So we're seeing setup very much similar to like the Stop the Steal stuff in 2020. What I'm hearing though is that people are more concerned about protections for election workers and like what they have or don't have, making sure they're safe to do their jobs. But I am keeping an eye on places where there are election officials who refuse to certify in other recent cases, whether in 2020 or in recent statewide elections, setting the stage for potential avenues for challenges we might see. And then the active legal challenges that are like a little bit more widespread and complex and have to do with laying the groundwork for potential challenges, but don't necessarily mean that there will be challenges after election day, just sort of like throwing wrenches into the process, which I can go into detail on some of these, but they're like a little bit in the weeds. But I think broadly, like concerns about last minute voter roll purges. Just today, the Supreme Court paused a lower court ruling in Virginia that ordered them to restore like 1,600 voters who were purged from the rolls too close to election day. So that ruling means that those people will not be restored to the voter rolls in time for election day. So keeping an eye on things like that. And then, I think it's really hard to say like in terms of potential challenges, like until they actually happen, but certainly keeping an eye on those places where there are election skeptics running state boards. Like in Georgia, there are several counties where election deniers and extreme Trump people still run the election boards in Spalding and Troop and Ware, some other places. But I think the other major like themes of legal challenges that we're seeing are changes to voting admin, claims about like cybersecurity and voting machines, questions about the authority of local election officials to say that they're not going to certify because of some concern about or suspicion of fraud, whether it's valid or not. So those are the sorts of things that we're keeping an eye on, and that would make it grease the wheels and make it easier to pose challenges after the election takes place.
An interesting question that just came in. Do you think contesting election results might stop after Trump stops running, or has he kind of opened Pandora's box for us to for someone always to say, "Oh wait, I actually won"?
Well, I don't think it's a new phenomenon. If you look back to Bush and Gore in 2000, I think what has changed is kind of taking it out of the polite chambers of courtrooms and really turning it into this kind of nasty culture war kind of thing, which you saw the beginning of that in 2000 with the Brooks Brothers riot. But clearly that there's a big difference between the Brooks Brothers riot and the QAnon shaman. So that's where we are today, and I think it's going to continue. Even if Trump loses, it's clear that the party has been reshaped in his image.
There were a handful of questions about that idea of protests or even violence after the election. Are people hearing anything in their reporting right now, just about either preparations for that or how seriously people should take those that kind of speculation?
Yeah, there's been some reporting about people like Trump supporters saying, they're just going to be out in droves on election day, like ready to do whatever. But it's like old man yelling at the wind stuff. It's like there's not really anything that they can do. It's just people sort of talking about like we're going to be there. And so that could lead to anything. Nobody expected January 6th to happen. I don't necessarily think that we're facing something that insane, but we could see random sort of outbursts of people, and a lot of this coming from either blatant misunderstanding or willful misunderstanding of what's actually happening on the ground. I think there's a lot of confusion, and the Trump campaign is leading its supporters to believe that there are all these things going on that are not going on. So truly, truly anything could happen. So it's scary.
One thing that we didn't get to, but there were 2 or 3 audience questions about, is candidates' differences or similarities on climate policy. It feels like a void of discourse this cycle at a moment when the country and the world, and I got the images out of Spain yesterday are just horrifying. It's so obviously a central issue, but it's so quiet this year on the cycle. Is anyone hearing any? Do we expect any policy changes in any way that may move things in a better direction? Yeah, that's what I'm hearing too. It's been a remarkable shift, I'd say, especially considering when you talk to young voters or even look at polling about young voters' priorities around climate, around ceasefire. It does feel like there are so many issues that are just being overlooked right now by both of the candidates.
Yeah, the only thing I would say on that is like this came up a little bit. I don't know if it was at the DNC or at some sort of candidate forum, and like all I remember was Harris, forcefully telling someone that she did not say that she didn't support fracking or something. Like that's where the discourse is right now. I think climate is so far off the agenda for both parties. If anything, it's not even part of the planning. It's like green infrastructure, the IRA passed under Biden or whatever, and there were supposed to be some carve outs for clean jobs and stuff in there. But I think Democrats have realized that they can sort of get away with making promises that they don't necessarily fulfill. And so many other things have eclipsed that in terms of like what media is paying attention to, what is top of mind for, middle of the road voters, et cetera, et cetera. So it truly has fallen off, sort of the platform for both of them. The flip side of that is being, pro corporate, pro fossil fuel policies, which are, prevalent, I think, with both candidates. Just sort of like sticking with how traditionally how those policies have been bipartisan. I don't think there's any shifts that we can really expect.
Thanks, Kayla. Unfortunately, that's all the time we actually have today. We got so many more questions in the chat that we had time to answer, and I'm sorry I didn't get through all of them, but I'm really grateful for your engagement. Thanks so much for attending this conversation. If you're interested in supporting our work, please go to the donation link in the chat or contact Celine Pizer to discuss how you can be a critical part of this journalism going forward. I want to thank Akela, Jessica, and Matt, and really everyone who was part of this conversation, throwing in your questions and made it so lively and I hope informative. We hope you join us in the fight for a strong, independent media by supporting our work going forward. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks.